Daniel 3. When I was given Bible studies, my teacher did not study with me Daniel 3 as a normal Bible study. But Daniel 3 is a very, very important chapter in Old Testament history. We view it as history, as a narrative of something that happened to the children of Israel, particularly Daniel and his three friends, or Daniel's three friends, because Daniel isn't seen in this chapter. We do not know why he is not there. But it could have been various reasons, and we're not going to spend time speculating about that. But we see the three Hebrews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego there, and their lives are a testimony to their faith as well. While chapter 2 is basically about the faith of Daniel, chapter 3 is about the faith of his three friends. So there are some points that need to be remembered in Daniel. What was the time period of the book of Daniel? We looked at already, but what was the time period that the book of Daniel was especially written for? Let's read in chapter 12, verses 9 and 13, also verse 4. Chapter 12, verses 9 and 13 have two different phrases. Chapter 12, verses 4 and 9 give the same phrase. We see there in those two verses, 4 and 9, that it was written for what time? It says the time of the end. And in chapter 12, verse 13, it says, stand in thy lot at the end of the days. So Daniel was particularly written for which period of time? The end of time, the end of days. So we have to consider that when we're looking at the book of Daniel. And if it was written for the end of time, why is chapter 2 included? Why is chapter 3 included? And the other chapters that we talk about as being basically narrative and historical. They have been written for us upon whom the ends of the world are come, for a reason. The book of Daniel contains two types of writings, as we've mentioned, the historical and the prophetic. And these two types of writing are both narrative in their nature. So they hold that in common. But now, this particular chapter has to do with Babylon and its actions against those who would not obey certain directives. So where does Babylon come from? What is the origin of Babylon? Remember when we studied hermeneutics, we said whenever we have a subject, an idea, a concept, a person, where do we need to go to find out the origin of that? We need to go to the original and the first occurrence. Where do we find the first occurrence of Babylon? In Genesis chapter 10, verses 8 through 10. So let's take those verses and begin at the beginning. Chapter 10 of Exodus, verses 8 through 10. And there we read these words. And Cush begat Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one in the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and Uruk, and Akkad, and Calach, and in the land of Shinar. It tells us here that Nimrod was the beginning of something, beginning of Babylon. And this word, beginning here, I believe is the same word we find at the beginning of the Bible, in the beginning. Reshit, or Bereshit in Hebrew. And in chapter 11, verses 1 through 9, we have a description of this Babylon, about this great city, that the Lord beheld the people, and one day he said, I'm going to go down and confuse them. So Babel, or Babylon, or this word comes to mean confusion. So that's why it says the name of it is called Babel, chapter 11, verse 9. because there it was that God confused the languages. Very interesting if you do a careful analysis of the genealogy of Babylon from the time of Noah. We have Peleg. And what does it say of Peleg? In his days the earth was divided. If you do a careful chronology, you'll find that Peleg was born 100 years after the flood, after the end of the flood. And we see that he lived 238 years. So it seems that there was a division among the people of God. After they came out of the ark, about 100 years, they lived together. And at that time when there was a division among them, the people left. And this child was born, and he was named Peleg. And then at his death, it is assumed, that is when the Tower of Babel was brought into confusion. So the Tower of Babel of confusion occurred 238 years after the flood, approximately. So Peleg's birth noted the separation between the people who served God and those who wanted to go their own way and went to the valley of Mesopotamia. And then there others were who stayed in the mountain were considered the true people of God. And down in the valley, there were these people who were building this great tower. Now, how long is 238 years? Does that seem like a very long time to you in Bible history? Well, let's go back 238 years from right now. Where would we be if we went back 238 years? Subtract where we are. Let's just say 212 years. Where would we be? 1800. And go back another 26 years. We would go back to what period of time?
1774.
Yeah, about the time of the American Revolution. So what has happened in Earth's history in this time? A lot. A great deal. And the Industrial Revolution and all the things that we have to do with technology today. And we were just studying, someone was saying that the people before the flood were much more intelligent than we are. Is that true? Yes, and they had developed technology that we can't even probably imagine. Well, were the people after the flood also very intelligent? What do you think?
Yes.
I think they were. They lived a long time. They lived 200, 300, 400 years. And in that time, they could develop a lot of things. Maybe they started from basically nothing, but if we go back 238 years from right now, they had very little. Horse and buggy. They had maybe rifles and cannons and some knowledge of medicine. But if we think of what's happened in the last 238 years, or 338 years, that'd go back even further, wouldn't it? So we can say that they probably developed a very highly mechanized and also tight society. So we see that the beginning of Babylon was a great deal of knowledge, and they had all the same language. There wasn't any confusion among them until the Tower of Babel and God confused them. Let's go now to Jeremiah chapter 25 and see what was going on in Israel at this time. And by the way, if you look into the book of Jeremiah and you look for Babylon, or particularly north, because where did Babylon come from when it came into Israel? Did it come from the east or west or south? No, it came from the north. And so Babylon is always referred to, or is referred to at times, as coming from the north, as the king of the north. That is significant when we get into Daniel chapter 11. So it would be very interesting to look up the word north and Babylon in the book of Jeremiah alone and see how many times north is associated with Babylon. We find in Jeremiah 25, verse 9, this is the chapter where it says that in verse 11, we're going to read 9, 11, and 12. Chapter 25, verse 11 is where it talks about the 70 years. It says it also in Jeremiah 29, verse 10, which we're not going to read right now, but it says basically the same thing as 25, 11. We're going to read 9. It says, Behold, I will send and take all the families of the north, saith the Lord, and Nebuchadnezzar the king of Babylon, my servant, and will bring them against this land and against the inhabitants thereof and against all these nations round about. Now, where was Babylon in relationship to Palestine, in relation to Jerusalem? Was it from the north? No, it was directly east. But here it says from the north, because they went directly, they didn't come directly, they went around the great desert and came in from the north, while Egypt was to the south. And it goes on and says, and I will utterly destroy them and make them an astonishment and a hissing and a perpetual desolation. So the prophecy in verse 11 says, and the whole land shall be desolate, it says, and an astonishment, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. So the land was promised to be desolate for how long a period? 70 years. And again in verse 12 it makes that point. And it shall come to pass when 70 years are accomplished that I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation, saith the Lord, for their iniquity and the land of the Chaldeans, and I will make it perpetual desolations. So not only was Babylon used to desolate Israel, but what happened to Babylon later? What happened to them later? It says that Babylon was to be a desolation. What happened to the city of Babylon? It was destroyed. And the prophecy was that only jackals and owls would live there. Even today, that place is desolate after all that time. While Israel was repopulated. Even though God desolated Israel for their sins, they repented. Babylon did not. Is there a picture in that for us? Think about that for a moment. Babylon was a ceaseless desolation where God's people were desolated, but they were what? Repopulated. Is there a picture in that? Do you see any connection between the plan of salvation and what God's going to do? What is this earth? This earth was, according to Isaiah, made to be inhabited. Is it going to be desolate? When is it going to be desolate? During the millennium, correct? But God is going to repopulate it. Right? He's going to repopulate it. But what's going to happen to Babylon? Babylon, we see in Revelation 19, is cast where? Into the lake of fire. In chapter 20, we see that the devil is thrown into the lake of fire where the false prophet and where the beast and the false prophet are. And we understand the beast to be symbol of Babylon, another symbol. So we see that there are some parallels here, and we need to start drawing some conclusions from the first 3 chapters of Daniel related to the plan of salvation. Yes, the last time we talked about the importance of bringing in the plan of salvation into our study of Daniel 2. That we're not just showing times and relationships of nations and so forth, but we're showing what God is doing in the lives of people and how he's working. There's one other thing that we need to look at here, which is very, very important, and that is Revelation 14. Let's look here at Revelation 14, verse 8. What do we see in the second angel's message? It's repeated, the second angel's message repeated in Revelation 18, 2 and 3, and we'll look there also. But what does it say in Revelation 14, verse 8? I'm sure you know the verses. And another angel, second angel followed. And what do we read there in that verse? Let's read it. Revelation 14, verse 8. And notice one thing that should be noted carefully about this statement. It is just a statement. The first and third angels are said to have a loud voice or a strong voice. And here it just says that there followed another angel saying. It doesn't give a loud voice. Where in Revelation 18, it has great power. And we'll talk more about that when we get there. But it says, Babylon is fallen, that great city, because she hath made nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. So what do we see here about Babylon? How is this related to the origin of Babylon, the mention of Babylon in Jeremiah, and here in Revelation 18 and verse 14? What conclusions can we draw? Is the picture here that we're seeing in Daniel chapter 3 something for us to consider as far as end time events is concerned and the parallels that we're going to see and are seeing at the end of time? And we're living in that time when these things are being fulfilled. We should learn something from the book of Daniel, particularly chapters 1, 2, and 3. Now, before we leave Revelation, we're going to look at Revelation 17, verse 5. Revelation 17, verse 5. It says, "Upon her head was a name written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots, and the abomination of the earth." So we have a picture here in the city of Babylon, in the nation of Babylon, that is a portrait, is a, we could say, some kind of analogy or even an analogy. There's another word for that. What do you call it when you have a parable? It's more than a parable. Apostle Paul used that in, he used the word when he was talking about Jerusalem, New Jerusalem, as well as earthly Jerusalem. I can't remember the word right now. But it's like a parable for us. Okay, so we see in Daniel chapter 3 the real state of Babylon, and we're going to look now at some of the common themes in Babylon that's stated there. Some very significant words and phrases. 10 times in this one small chapter it says, worship and fall down. Okay? So it talks about falling down, worship and falling down. 10 times it talks about the golden image. 8 times it talks about the burning fiery furnace. 6 times worship the golden image. 3 times it talks about people, nations, and languages. Do we see those phrases anywhere in the book of Revelation? Similar phrases? What about the first angel's message? What does it say? Fear God and worship him, right? So it's talking about worship. What about the second angel's message? Babylon is fallen, right? The third angel's message, any man worship the beast in his image. So we have similar nomenclature, words that are very similar in the book of Revelation and point back to these chapters, these early chapters in the book of Daniel. So what is this chapter really about? What can we say? I would say that God's ways are greater than Satan's ways. What was chapter 2 about? That the God of Israel is greater than the God of the Babylonians. And that's what was being proved throughout the book, throughout the chapter 2. That is one of the things that was being said about the book of Daniel, the chapter 3. That God's ways are superior to those of Satan. Okay, this chapter also represents the diminishing of earthly kingdoms. Sister White puts it this way, represents deterioration of earthly kingdoms. That's in Youth Instructor, September 22, 1903. She also says, those who obey God will be honored. That's in Manuscript Releases 82, 1900. So also, she says in September Youth Instructor, September 8, 1903, the difference between wisdom of God and the wisdom of man. So this chapter shows differences, a contrast again. What did Daniel do when he came before the king? He contrasted what? What the astrologers, soothsayers, and the Chaldeans could do with what God could do. He didn't say what I can do, but what God can do. And here we see a difference, a contrast between what the wisdom of man can do as opposed to what the wisdom of God will produce. And what will the wisdom of God produce? What is God's ways and wisdom going to produce? How many people went into captivity by this time? We're not sure exactly, but at least the book possibly in the time of Daniel. How many were there? 800 perhaps. But how many stood faithful? 3. Stay faithful. So when we look at the time of the end, when we look at ourselves, when we consider our own experience, what was it that caused these men to be able to stand faithful or to determine to be faithful? I think Daniel was an influence in their lives, don't you? He was an influence. His leadership had an effect on their lives. And your leadership can have an effect on the lives of others as well. Whether you're young or older, your leadership can make a difference in the lives of others. Your attitude and how you approach things. So Daniel had placed himself in the forefront, we see in Daniel chapter 2. Now we see his 3 friends in the forefront in this challenge. So the way we dress, the way we talk, our attitude, the atmosphere that comes around us has an effect upon others. And we see that Daniel had an effect upon these 3 men. We're going to go back now, right now, to the book of Revelation, but not to chapter 14. We're going to go back to 13 just for a moment and look at some of the things that this chapter has in relationship or in common with this chapter, chapter 13. Just briefly, if we can, not spending a lot of time, but bringing out some of the important relationships between these 2 concepts. What do we see in Revelation chapter 13? We see the 2 beasts, the one coming up out of the sea and the one coming up out of the earth. Let's look at the words, some of the words we were just mentioning that are relatively found very often in this chapter of Revelation, of Daniel 3, as opposed to what happens in Revelation 13. We see in verses 3 and 4 the word worship, or the concept of worship at least. And I saw one of his heads that were wounded to death, and the deadly wound was healed, and all the world wondered after the beast, or we could say worship. And then it says, and they worshiped the dragon that gave power unto the beast. So we see this concept of worshiping that which is opposed to God. Verse 8 in the same chapter brings out that word again. And they all that dwell upon the earth worshiped him. We go again in verse 12. And they exercise all the power of the first beast before him, and causes the earth and them that dwell therein to worship the first beast. This is the second beast, causing the whole world. And verse 15, and he had power to give life unto the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause as many as should not worship the image of the beast should be killed. So we see a similarity between the often used phrases in Daniel 3 with the often used words and phrases in Daniel and Revelation 13. Let's look at another. We just have a couple of references to image, verses 14 and 15. We see in this verse also, verses 14 and 15, all they that dwell on the earth, whose miracles he had power to do in the sight of the beast, saying to them that dwell on the earth that they should make an image to the beast. Do we have an image made in Daniel chapter 3? Absolutely. An image that is all of gold, not as he had originally seen. And then in verse 15, and had power to give life unto the image of the beast. Now, worship the image is also here in verse 15. It says that as many should not worship the image of the beast should be killed. Now, the universality of these things we find in at least 6 places in the book of Revelation chapter 13. It says in verse 7 and 8, and there was war in heaven, Michael and his angels fought, and the dragon and his angels fought. So there was a universal war in heaven. And in verse 8, we see, and prevail not, neither was there found place for him any more in heaven. Verse 12, therefore rejoice, ye heavens, and all that dwell in, woe to the inhabitants of the earth and the sea, that for the devil has come down to you having great wrath. So there was a universal situation in heaven, and that universal situation has been now transferred, and has come here to this earth. We often wonder, why here? Why is this happening to us? Why are we the subject of this great controversy? Well, I don't think I can answer that in full in a few words or even at all, but God has his purpose. He has a purpose for this, to prepare a people to be with him for eternity and to understand him as no other creatures in the universe can understand him. And it says the serpent was cast out. In verse 15 it says, and the serpent cast out of his mouth water as a flood after the woman. So here we have a universal flood almost, a reference to, in a way, Noah's flood. And the earth helped the woman and opened up her mouth and swallowed up the flood which the dragon cast out of his mouth. That's verse 16. So we see that this thing that has happened in chapter 3 is taken up and projected in the book of Revelation. So when we're studying the verses of Daniel chapter 3, we need to think of where it's going in its subject and what it's telling us of future events about. Now, let's go to the book of Daniel and come to some very significant points that we will use to outline the chapter. First of all, I'd like your help, if you will. What is the significance of the first verse of Daniel? Remember, there was a very great significance about the Daniel 2 in its first and last verses, Daniel 1 also. What is the significance of the first verse here? What do we see? We see Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold whose height was, how high? 60 feet high, or 60 cubits high. How high is that? It's 90 feet. 60 cubits, maybe 100 feet, something like that. And it says it was 6 cubits wide. 6 cubits wide for 100 feet tall is not very wide. It was a pretty skinny thing. Because, you have this wide and you have 60 feet or 60 cubits would be how many stories? 10-story Centauri building, right? Almost like a flagpole. Pretty broad, but pretty skinny. That's how big it was. But it was significant. It could be seen for a long, long way off. And he made it all of gold. And that tells us that he had in mind that his kingdom would last forever. So we have some significant information here, and he set up an image that everyone was to obey or to bow down to. We see that again, of course, in the book of Revelation. Where do we see it? In the three angels' messages. So is there any connection between this and the three angels' message? We need to think about that. How is that going to apply? Secondly, what is the significance of verses 7 and 12? And do we see any significance of that let's say in Revelation 13? Let's read them. And therefore at that time, when all the people heard the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and all kinds of music, all the people, the nations of the languages, fell down and worshipped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So what do we have here? A universal movement to worship this image, which Babylon had set up. In verse 12, and the certain Jews whom thou hast set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, these men, O king, have not regarded thee. They serve not thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. So there was an exception of all those people on the plain of Dura who were to bow down. There were 3 lonely figures standing there who didn't bow down, and therefore we see what happened. They were threatened. They agreed not to do what the king said. It's very interesting what they said. It doesn't matter what God allows or what God does to us. We're not going to serve you. So we see here in verses 15 and 26 something also significant we should know. If ye be ready, that at what time ye hear the sound of the cornet and so forth, ye fall down and worship the image of the beast that I have made, well. But if ye worship not, ye shall be cast into that same hour into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. And who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hands? Well, we see that he was faced with this God in the previous chapter, But now he's threatening, almost God, to prove that he can do it. And what do we see in verse 26? And Nebuchadnezzar came near to the mouth of the burning fiery furnace and spake unto Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Ye servants of the Most High God, come forth. So we see a contrast here. Who is that God? And now he's admitting that God is the Most High God in verse 26. So there was a change in his attitude over this period of time, and that change was brought about by what? By the faithfulness of these three men who stood for God even at this time. And was it an easy thing for them to do? Well, I don't know about you, but when all the world is against you, what are you going to do? When everybody in school and everybody else is doing all these things, what do kids come home and say? Dad, can I have some of these shoes or some of that? Or can I go here and go that? Well, why do you want that? Well, everybody's doing it. Everybody else is doing it. Isn't that the answer, most kids? Have you ever said that? Everybody else is doing it? Yeah, well, that's what they didn't do. They didn't say that. If they said that, they would have bowed down with everyone else. So, ye servants of the Most High God. And this is actually an Aramaic term, and it's very close to Elohim, but not exactly the same, but it means the same thing. So he was using a word that was Aramaic, that was Elah, which was Aramaic for Elohim. It's somewhat similar, but it meant the Most High God. All right, when we go now to Genesis chapter 14, what do we see there? Let's look there for a moment at this idea about God. Genesis 14, verses 18 through 22. Genesis 14, 18 through 22. Now, it says here, verse 18, And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I have gotten me honor upon Pharaoh, upon his chariots, and upon his horsemen. And the angel of God which went before the camp of Israel, removed and went behind them, and the pillar of the cloud went from before their face and stood behind them, and it came between the camp of the Egyptians and the camp of Israel, and it was a cloud of darkness to them, but it gave light by night to these. That was darkness to the Egyptians, but light to the children of Israel, so that the one came not near the other all the night. And Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all the night, and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. And we go on to read, and it says, And the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea upon the dry ground, and the waters were a wall unto them on their right hand and on their left hand. So we see a very interesting experience here. And if we would look in Isaiah chapter 43, verse 2, we have an allusion to that and a future projection there also of what Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego went through. Isaiah 43, verse 2. So what did God do for the Israelites? He hemmed them in. He hid them in the cloud. That when they went through the sea, they were protected from behind. God was their rear reward. He was behind them with this cloud. We see in Isaiah 43, verse 2, the promise, And when thou passest through the waters, I will be with thee, and through the rivers they shall not overflow thee. And then it says, When thou walkest through the fire, thou shalt not be burned, neither shall the flame kindle upon thee. So we have, in this one verse, an allusion to Israel, and also a prophetic statement almost of what would happen to the children of Israel who were thrown in the fiery furnace. And we know their answer. We know the experience that they made. They said, if God will deliver us, so be it. He has the power to do it. Whether he does it or not, that's up to him. So what was their attitude? What was the attitude of the children of Israel here at this point, these three men?
They did not fear for their life at all.
Because their life was hid where?
In God.
In God. in God in Christ. So what God does with us is whose business? It's his business, isn't it? But what we do with God is our business. You know, I often like to say, I am not so concerned about going to heaven. Does that sound like a heretical statement? Well, I'll make it on tape. Because it is, if I could go to heaven right now, if I had the means to go to heaven, I would go there. No doubt. But I'm not concerned about that. That's not my interest. If God wants to park a chariot out on the street here and say, Brother Watts, it's time for you to go, he could do that. Couldn't he do that? All right? He could say, you're ready. Let's go. But if he doesn't do that, that's his business. It's not mine. But what I do with God is my business. But what God does with me is his business. And so the children of Israel here, these three men, knew that their lives were in God's hands. I have another friend named Sam. He says, you are invincible until God is through with you. Right? Do you have that faith that you're invincible, that you're immortal, that you're better than some of these superstars that we see on that can be seen on the silver screen? That nothing can happen to them. God has a plan for you, and when you are in his hands, it doesn't matter what God does with you, but it does matter what you do with God. So we see here that we have some very interesting things to look at here in this chapter. And before we go forward, I would like you to look at the significance of verse 18. And that's what we're talking about. This is the verse we're speaking of. But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. Doesn't matter what you do to us. We know what we have to do. We have to serve the living God. If we look in Exodus chapter 20, verse 3, what does it say there? What does Exodus 20, verse 3 say? It's the second commandment. What does it say? Thou shalt not, and that's verse 2. Says, thou shalt not have any other gods before me. That's verse, you're right, that's verse 3. And what does it go on to say in verses 4 and 5? That's the ones I was referring to. Right? Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image or bow down to them, etc. So they took that literally and simply as it was written. Now, in Daniel 7:25, very important verse, when we get to chapter 7, a center of the book, actually, of the chapter of chapter 7, and he shall speak great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change times and laws, and they shall be given into his hands until times, and the dividing of times. So we see in Daniel chapter 7, there was going to be a power which was going to require worship and was going to change times and laws and cause people to worship him or wear out the saints of the Most High. So there was a time when persecution came on the people of God and they were not spared. But now in this case, they are spared. In Matthew chapter 15, verse 9, Jesus mentions that in vain they do worship me, teaching for doctrine the commandments of men. And what did the apostles have to say about that? We will not follow the commandments of men. We will follow the commandments of God. And again, in Revelation 12, we know the verse very well. What does it say in Revelation 12, verse 17? And the dragon was wroth with the woman and went to make war with the remnant of the seed which keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus. And verse 12 of chapter 14, here is the patience of the saints. Here are they that keep the commandments of God and have faith of Jesus. And we know that 22:19, which is near the end of the Bible, it says, and if any man shall take away from the words of this book, what was going to happen to him? God was going to take his name out of the book of life. If you add to the book, which is Revelation 22, verse 18, what's going to happen to you? God's going to add to you the plagues that are found in this book. So we are counseled neither to take away nor to add to the book, but say it just like it is. Now I'd like to ask you to help me for a minute. If you were standing on the plain of Dura, and you were tempted, you're going to be tempted to bow down. Can you rationalize any way in your own mind what kind of rationale perhaps the other people who did bow down might have thought to think in order to save their skin at that moment? What kind of rationale could they have made? What's that?
If it was a Hebrew, they could have thought to themselves, I'll just repent of it later.
Yeah, I'll just take care of this later. I just bring an offering and then that'll fix it. Right? I'll do it and fix it. Right? What else?
I was going to say basically that they had said afterwards I'll repent or I'll ask the Lord to forgive me after.
Yeah,
I don't want to die right now.
I've got a sacrifice. I'll just make that sacrifice and it'll be all okay. Now, what kind of thinking is that? Isn't that kind of Catholic thinking? Do we have that same kind of mentality sometimes? Oh, I know I shouldn't do this, but I'm going to anyway. Right? Would that have served them very well? You know, one of the greatest problems the early Christian church had was those people who compromised their faith in order not to be persecuted. And then after the persecution left or was over, they wanted to come back to the church, and the church had a great deal of argument of whether or not they should be accepted back in the church as members. Because they went away, they went with the world, and they denied their faith, and then when times were good and times were easy, they wanted to be members of church again. And there was a great debate in the early church about that. And so we look now at these men, and they could have made different kinds of rationale. You know, God doesn't want us to unnecessarily give up our lives for such a silly thing. Why should I die just because the king says I have to bow down? Well, I could. This is really ridiculous. It's such a little thing. Right? And don't people say today, oh, that's such a little thing. It doesn't really matter very much. How can that be important? It's not rational to think that way. Well, according to what we see in the book here, it's very rational. Because what does God say in Hebrews 13, verse 5? I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. So what happened to these young men who were faithful in the face of death? We read in verse 30, it says, and the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. All right. Let's think for a moment now. I'm going to read a testimony, and we're going to close the study, but we're going to make a very important, significant conclusion. This is from the Great Controversy, page 606. Thus the message of the third angel will be proclaimed. What angel did she say? Referring to chapter 3 of Daniel. Thus the message of the third angel will be proclaimed. What is the third message? What is the third message? Okay, let's work backwards for a moment. I'm going to read the rest of this testimony in a moment. But she associates what chapter with the third angel's message? The third chapter of Daniel. Is it possible that the second chapter of Daniel corresponds to the second angel's message? What is the second angel's message? Babylon is fallen. What happened in the second chapter? Were not the gods and the ways of Babylon brought into the dust? Was not the image also, which was hit by the rock at its feet, what would happen to it? It was turned to dust. The image was what? Fallen, was it not? So when we look in chapter 2, what do we see in allegory? That's the word I was looking for earlier. Allegory. We see an allegory of actually the second angel's message. What do we see in the third book, the third chapter of Daniel? We see an allegory of what? The third angel's message. What about the first angel's message? Do we see that in the first chapter of Daniel? Can you make the corollary? Can you make the allegory? What was Daniel challenged to do? To compromise. Compromise in little things, right? To not be firm and steady in his allegiance to God. To not hide his allegiance to the God of heaven. And to do so in what way? In the way he conducted his life, even in the very food that was set on his table. So we see in Daniel chapter 1, you can say, if you want to, properly, according to the statement in what Sister White says, thus the message of the third angel will be proclaimed. Speaking of Daniel chapter 3. We can say also chapter 1 is an allegory or a lesson for us of how we should understand the first angel's message. What is the first angel's message? Fear God and give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment has come. And worship him that made heaven and earth, the sea, and the fountains of waters, and all that in is. So we find that chapter 1 is for us a lesson book of a real understanding of the first angel's message. Chapter 2, Babylon has fallen. And that's what we see in chapter 2. And in chapter 3, don't worship the image of the beast. Any man who does that will receive of the plagues of God and the wrath of God. So now, we have made now in the first 3 chapters of Daniel a correlation of what we will see and understand in its reality, in its real import and meaning of Daniel and Revelation. Particularly the 3 angels' message. And what are we studying in the book of Daniel? What is it all about? It's about judgment, is it not? What is the center point of the Advent message? Is it not the judgment hour message? Yes, it is. And so as we learn to present the book of Daniel in its clarity, in its simplicity, and in its power, we will also confirm the message that God has given us. And what is that message? Jesus is going to very soon leave the heavenly sanctuary when all the decisions have been made. And where is the decision going to begin? At the house of God, with the ancient men of the house of God. That's where it's going to begin. And it's going to end with the message being known in all the earth, and everyone who has an opportunity, everyone will have an opportunity to take up his own case before God, whether he will accept the message or not. Now let's read this paragraph from the Great Controversy and see what we can see in these words that apply to this message which we have here in the 3rd chapter of Daniel. Thus the message of the third angel will be proclaimed, as the time comes for it to be given with greatest power. The Lord will work through humble instruments, leading the minds of those who consecrate themselves to his service. The laborers will be qualified rather by the unction of his Spirit than by the training of literary institutions. Men of faith and prayer will be constrained to go forth with holy zeal, declaring the words which God gives them. The sins of Babylon will be laid open. The fearful results of enforcing the observance of the church by civil authority, the inroads of spiritualism, the stealthy but rapid progress of the papal power, all will be unmasked. Everything is working by stealth now, she says in another place. But eventually, it will all be unmasked. By these solemn warnings, the people will be stirred. Thousands upon thousands will listen who have never heard words like these. In amazement, they hear the testimony that Babylon is the church fallen because of her errors and sins, because of her rejection of the truth sent to her from heaven. As the people go to their former teachers with the eager inquiry, are these things so? The ministers present fables, prophesy smooth things to soothe their fears and quiet the awakened conscience. But since many refuse to be satisfied with the mere authority of men and demand a plain, thus saith the Lord, the popular ministry, like the Pharisees of old, filled with anger as their authority is questioned, will denounce the message as of Satan and stir up the sin-loving multitudes to revile and persecute those who proclaim it. So what does it say here? Men and women, we might say, of faith and prayer, constrained by a holy zeal, declaring the words of God given to them, will have the unction of the Holy Spirit and be qualified by the Spirit of God. Do you want to be among those people who God wants to use in these last days? It tells us here, humble instruments who consecrate themselves to his service, God will use. I pray that he will use you in these hours and that we will not be among those who make excuses for not obeying God. And where do we need to begin? We need to begin in the simple, everyday things of life. Things like taking care of that, being where we're supposed to be and doing what we're supposed to do and eating what we're supposed to eat and dressing what we're supposed to dress. Those little things that God has given us to take care of in our little kingdom, in our little world. Taking care that we have ordered our lives aright before God in everything. Try, I beg you, please, help me and help your brothers and help yourself by taking care of the little things in your life. And be faithful in that which is least, and God will help you, and he will give you the power to be faithful in that which is much. So we have a lesson here from the book of Daniel of what we should be in our day. May God help us to hear that message for ourselves personally, is my prayer. Amen.